Today on Chasing Leviathan, we pursue the big question, what is intimacy? My guest is Dr. Chris Lauer, the Chair of Philosophy at the University of Hawaii at Hilo. Come, have a seat with us, and learn to listen with me. Tell us a little about, Dr. Christopher Lauer. What was been your journey into philosophy, and how did you come to be a philosopher, if I can use that term? And what drew you to intimacy, to write a book about intimacy? What was that journey like as well?
Okay, I guess for the philosopher question, it was kind of a two-step process. I came to college not really even thinking that being a professor was an option. It was one of those jobs like shoe salesman that if you asked me about it, I would have known that people did that, but I never even thought about doing it myself.
That's the first time I've heard someone compare philosophers to shoe salesmen. I love it.
But when I got to college, it was at Berkeley, and I took a rhetoric class in a department that at the time was headed by Judith Butler, who I didn't know it at the time, but is a very famous philosopher. And although I didn't take any classes from her, a number of the professors in the department had a similar orientation to hers, and kind of led us in the direction of being able to read her work. I think that was one of the goals by the time we graduated, that we would be good readers of her. And so that made me realize that thinking could actually be something that mattered. In a way that I hadn't really thought about before. My kind of backup plan, my default plan, as it were, when I came to college was something to do with wind power. So climate change was the issue of our day. Didn't know what I would do, but I was good enough at science and other stuff that I figured I'd find a way to do something meaningful that way. But then that all changed when I realized that ideas matter. And it wasn't until my final year of college that I decided that I wanted to study philosophy in graduate school. It was a kind of confluence of things. All of the disciplines that call themselves theory, like political theory, post-colonial theory, gender theory, and so on. They were tremendously exciting, but the metabolism was just too fast for me. The reading a book in a week and then being expected to have an opinion on it, I instead wanted to read more slowly, and that's what led me to a history of philosophy program. And one version of that is I wanted to be more responsible with my scholarship than I had been as an undergrad. But another version of that is just to let my mind catch its breath and work through material more slowly. And the irony, in a way, is that as I've been teaching, I've moved more and more to the fast kind of thinking as a teacher. And that excitement that originally made me want to be an academic, that's much closer to how I teach now than the plodding, let's spend 50 minutes on a paragraph style of graduate school in philosophy.
And do you think that's
how it came out, philosophy?
Yeah. So is that movement to a faster type of philosophy? Do you think that's a measurement of your skill that you've gained, or is it just a change in style? What do you think has motivated that change?
I think it's more interactive with my students, that I'm feeling their energy level, and I just I don't have the discipline to enforce the plodding, rigorous, let's spend hours on this paragraph style. that I did in grad school. And so that leads me much more to the chasing squirrels style of everything that anyone wants to talk about, let's do it. It's exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. So they exercise you more, and so your metabolism's a little faster.
That's, yeah, I guess that's a charitable way of thinking about it. Yeah.
Excuse me. So how did you come to write? So we're talking today about your book Intimacy, which, when is that coming out?
Oh, it came out 5 years ago.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So,
oh, because
yeah.
I found you through the other book that is coming out. That's why. That makes sense.
No, the other book is even older. So, despite you fighting me on the new releases, I don't have any new releases right now. I'm kind of
must have come up in
stuck
like
on the
featured.
current book that I'm writing.
Oh, that's really interesting. I was looking through. It must have come up in like featured. They just like you that much. So this book is out, folks. You can find it. It is Intimacy by Dr. Christopher Lauer. Enjoyed the read. I appreciated. I think the high metabolism style makes sense. And I kind of wanted to ask you about the methodology of it. But before we do that, what prompted you to write this book?
So the first book that you mentioned, the Hegel and Schelling, the suspension of reason in Hegel and Schelling, that that was my dissertation, and um, it was my way of coming to terms with this challenge that we face in this in contemporary society of the fact that there are so many forces of unreason, and yet the answer to those forces of unreason can't be just doubling down on the rational. And the Intimacy book is part one of a three book project on recognition. And the idea is that everything that we care about is in some way based on either a need for recognition or a duty to give recognition to others. And so pretty much every ethical imperative in some way fits into that schema of recognition, as I see it. This is a hypothesis that was put forward in many ways. You can see it in Plato sometimes. Adam Smith has a version of it in his book on moral sentiments. Hegel is perhaps the most famous for advancing this hypothesis, and he largely gets it from his immediate predecessor, Fichte. And in the contemporary world, one of the most important thinkers arguing for recognition being at the center of philosophy is a Frankfurt School thinker named Axel Honneth. And so the structure of this 3-book series is my own take on the 3-part structure that both Hegel and Axel Honneth give, of us seeking recognition first and foremost in something immediate that I call intimacy. Honneth calls it love. Hegel associates it with the family. And then in something that is a little bit more formal, has a little bit more structure in it, I'm going to focus on value for that. For Hegel, the emphasis was more on legal personhood. And then the highest level, in a way, is solidarity. And I take that term from Axel Honneth, that what we're looking for in making our lives meaningful and figuring out what matters more than anything else is a way of telling our stories that can cohere or at least are compatible with the stories that other people tell about their own stories. And so I just started with intimacy, and because that was kind of the first part, but it didn't hurt that I started writing the book shortly after getting married, and I finished it up after my 2 children were born. And
Mm,
so there was a great deal of material that could kind of help me with that, and I was living through some of the most intense forms of intimacy. Luckily, I didn't make it to the final chapter during that period, which is all about mourning.
right.
So the mourning is the mourning chapter is mostly observed.
Mm.
I've lost people in my life, but while I was writing it, there was no one in particular that I was thinking about with that mourning relationship.
Though when you talk about the third in the dyads and the triads, and you talk about adding kids into the mix of a marriage, yeah, that I could see that definitely was very real to you in that moment.
Yeah, and really that started speaking to me before I even got married. So my wife and I only had one reading performed at our wedding that wasn't written by a family member. So we had things that were written by by people in our family that were kind of important documents to us. But the only thing that we had that was just by someone famous, or a text, as it were, was from the introduction to Luce Rigori's An Ethics of Sexual Difference. And it's a passage where she talks about the importance of wonder and about how that can be disrupted by the involvement of a third. And in particular, uh, couples, Rigori emphasizes, tend to lose that sense of wonder for each other when they make their relationship about a third, about a child, especially, or for particularly religious people, about God. That the meaning of a relationship is ultimately grounded in this higher or more foundational, depending on the metaphor, relationship to God. And for a Rigori, both of those are distractions from the between of the relationship.
Mm. Uh, really good. I looking at this, it's very clear, and I'm sure this is coming out of your work with Schelling and Hegel, but you dwell at length in this introduction on just your method and dialectic. So, if you don't mind sharing with our listeners, uh, as you understand it, because you give kind of a nuanced take on it, what is dialectics or dialectic that you use here, and why did you use it for this topic?
hmm yeah, it's a great question. So, um, dialectics, as far as I know, is first used as a technical philosophical term in Plato. And for Plato, dialectics is the stage of philosophy that carries one up to that point when one can finally know the good and do real philosophy. One could speak from a standpoint of knowing. And so dialectics is that stage where you're climbing up the divided line, as it were, where you are uh, formulating, and the Greek word that Plato uses is hypotheses,
Hmm.
literally stepping stones or things you put under your feet. And so um, dialectics then is an approach to philosophy that advances hypotheses, provisional ways of um, describing what is, what matters, and then working through the what if we pursued that hypothesis to the end. So, of course, that's what Socrates is doing through many of the dialogues, especially when he's emphasizing that he doesn't know anything. And even though Plato always has, or not always, but frequently, especially in the middle dialogues, emphasizes that, like in the Phaedo or the Republic, that there must be this point where the dialectics ends. You've got to have this point where you affix your knowledge, where you tie it down in some way. And the dialectical approach doesn't really do that. And so the two most important thinkers for me methodologically are Hegel and Beauvoir, both of whom I think use dialectical thinking in a playful way that aims to be structured, but also emphasizes the ways that our knowledge continually breaks down. So in the 19th century, with both Hegel and Marx, there is an emphasis that dialectics isn't something that is just going on between two interlocutors. It's something that is there in the world, that there is a kind of structure that we find in the world where certain hypotheses or attempts to make the world meaningful or attempts to make the world work in a certain way, they tend to break down.
Hmm.
And so that breakdown of attempts at making something work, I think, so Beauvoir here is my hero in describing the ways that those attempts break down. But in the specifics, at least, I think Hegel is really good at this. Hegel is often seen from up on high and read from the end, as it were. Just the point of Hegel is a goal of something called absolute knowing or absolute spirit in the mature system, where really what makes Hegel worth reading is the acute sense of irony that he evinces when he explores the breakdown of all these different ways of conceiving one's world. And Beauvoir has both that and a sense of humor about it. So if we follow Kierkegaard and say that humor is kind of the next step beyond irony, and then Hegel was very good at seeing the irony in the world. And Beauvoir can even see a little bit of humor in that as well. And so the reason why I think of recognition in general, at least the first two books, are going to be dialectical.
Mm-hmm.
The Solidarity book may have more of a narrative structure to it. But the reason why I called it a dialectical structure is I want to explore the ways that intimacy is something that we can find meaning in through the breakdown of any way of conceiving it. I don't think that there is an ideal of intimacy. And it's not just that human beings aren't equipped for intimacy, like there is some divine demand that's put upon us that we lowly humans can't meet. I think that it's an incoherent concept. I think that intimacy can't really mean anything at all. We can't give a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for what would constitute intimacy. And each of the 10 chapters in the intimacy book is aimed at showing a way that one of those hypotheses, one of those attempts at securing intimacy, breaks down in its own terms. And so the reason why I choose a dialectical approach is I think that that's actually how intimacy works. I think that's how recognition in general works. When we're looking for recognition, we're looking for something that ultimately doesn't even make sense. We can't even conceive of what we're looking for.
And so when you're okay with intimacy being incoherent because you think that ultimately recognition is incoherent, or we don't even know what we're asking for, or would incoherence be? Would you apply that to recognition as well in this project?
Yeah, to say I'm okay with it is, I think, to say too much because I'm still haunted by these problems. But I do think so. I do think that in applying a dialectical approach, we can find meaning even in the breakdown. One of my favorite quotes for organizing my thinking on this comes from Leonard Cohen, who says, "There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." And I think dialectics is really good at exploring the ways that this brokenness of our concepts allows light to get in. And that's one way that I contrast it with deconstruction. This, and for instance, Derrida's mature work, this is something that he's also aiming for too. So he spent his career in showing ways that texts break down on their own terms, that they have these conflicting aims just built into their very structure as texts, so much that you can't even say that the texts have a structure. They are deconstructing themselves as they go along. And that means that the mature Derrida is trying to articulate, okay, what is this horizon that emerges out of this breakdown? What is this democracy to come, for instance, that we can't really even articulate? And I think that jumps to the end. That's trying to say that, okay, we've done this, now where are we? And what I like about dialectical approaches like Hegel's and Beauvoir's is, no, it's in living that constant breakdown that we should look for that meaning. And these forms of intimacy, even though they are incoherent, you can't actually achieve intimacy with someone through touching them. That doesn't mean that we were dumb all along to be doing the touching, that we were to be pursuing intimacy through touching. Instead, we were we need to find some kind of meaning in, or rather, the structure of the meaning of intimacy appears in that breakdown of the concepts by which we might define intimacy.
Is any of this would any of this work with Camus' version of the absurd? Just that we create meaning even when it breaks down.
I possibly, but I read Camus. I mean, it's too much of a black box for me when I read it. It's just that there's this radical openness that emerges with the absurd, and you can go anywhere now. It's kind of like at the end of The Matrix when you got all that code and you realize, oh crap, I can fly now. And it's just like, I can do anything now. And code is just a bunch of scribbly stuff that's on the screen that way. And although I think it's a similar move, and I think that Hegel recognizes that in the breakdown of our rational ways of understanding the world, there is kind of a radical freedom that emerges. There's not much more to say at that point. Okay, yeah, we're free. And I think a dialectical approach, in Hegel's words, it tarries with the negative. It just hangs out in those various attempts at making sense of the world and plays around with them, and is even willing to kind of say, well, what if this way of trying to live one's life, what if it were just subtly different? Like, we know it didn't work for the Romans, or we know it didn't work for this particular form of life, but maybe there is a different way that you can be a Stoic and still make your life meaningful. And then you kind of work through it, and through a kind of dialectical imagination, other problems keep arising. And that effort just to play around at these doomed hypotheses, that's what dialectics, that's what gives it its substance.
Yeah, to make sure that I'm following you, and many times, and I've talked to philosophers who talk about the importance of foundational concepts, and they describe their project as a house that you have to make sure the foundation is secure and move on. And in this case, dialectics just rejects that model entirely, because its foundations are things that can be subtracted at any time when they are shown to not work.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although there is kind of still a structure in dialectical approaches like Hegel's, in that it doesn't, the later chapters make sense because they follow the earlier ones. And so it's because we failed to achieve intimacy through giving a gift, for instance, that we can seek it in, or that we try to seek it in other ways.
But a better
Actually, no, I like my
Go ahead.
first. I like that first formulation better. It's because it failed that we can seek it in other ways, not necessarily that we do have to try it in these new ways. Sorry,
No. And that is an important distinction between you can do something and you have to do something. So for me, it almost sounds more like there's a metaphor. Even as I was writing questions, one of the questions is, what have you learned about intimacy on this journey? Because it does feel like it has more of a journey and a history aspect to it than perhaps a housing structure. Like there's still a structure to a story, for instance, but it's very different from the kind of structure you expect from if I had cracks in the wall to let light in are all very well and good, but in Florida there's a lot of other things that get let in besides light. So does that am I tracking with you there, or what are your thoughts on that?
No, that's great. And I think there can be a tyranny of stories, though. And so, yes, we're the type of people. We're the type of beings that find meaning, especially in stories and in a relationship. Of course, one of the most important ways that we build intimacy is by telling our stories together. And I think that's even more crucial at the level of society when we talk about solidarity. But stories are always told in this way in retrospect. Even when you are telling the story of your future, you're telling the story of what will have been. And so for Hegel, that's the attitude of what he calls reason in a formal sense. So his technical term, vernunft, reason, is an ability to see a whole and find in that what it is that guided everything, something that is beyond the X cause Y cause Z, but rather, as in Kant's terms, the unconditioned. And so it's the power of reason that looks to the past and tells the story. And that's crucial for Hegel to being a citizen of the world. If you don't look to the past and try to understand what's rational about it, then you're just floating. But that's not the end for Hegel. For Hegel, reason is, in his Phenomenology of Spirit, chapter 5 in an 8-chapter book. So it's there in the middle. It's something that we eventually overcome. And we can't live solely on our lives being meaningful because of this story that we tell. Part of that, Camus is aware of too. It's this need for an openness that if everything that I've done is justified by some story and from something that is operating beyond the sequence of events that I live through, then we're not really free. And so, yes, telling a story is part of how we often try to find meaning. But that story is never going to be something that's shared. And so, like if a couple just has their story that like they find their meaning when at dinner parties someone asked them their story of how they met and they love it, and then they kind of interrupt each other and they say like that's what elevates the relationship more than anything, their story, just presenting it because they find it really charming and cute or whatever, then that's what I call a fetish.
Yeah.
That is something that is external to the between or whatever it is that would be there for the couple. And granted, there is no between. That's an incoherent idea too. But it's something that each of them ultimately is going to have a different kind of relationship to. It's something that if it's even if it's their story, there's going to be one person's relationship to the story versus the other person's relationship to the story.
Well, and it's interesting that that's I can see the point that you're making. For me, it seems like a dead end anyways, because at some point, if the most important thing is telling your story, then living forward doesn't really make sense, because if all your meaning is wrapped up in telling the past, then like that storytelling itself starts to take place in time, and you can't tell. I can't imagine telling a story about telling your story and considering that meaningful, right? Or am I missing something there?
Well, it gets boring pretty fast. Of course, couples do. I mean, they love telling a story about how he always tells the story this way. And so that's kind of like this meta level of I get him because I know that he's going to tell the story this way, and he's going to get this one part. He's going to skew this one.
You always
part
get that
in
wrong.
A way that I
Yeah.
can predict.
Yeah.
But yeah, in general, yeah, you're right that you get diminishing returns the more meta you get in your stories about your stories.
Yes, which is part of. I mean, and I think that comes out a little bit in the fetish chapter as well. But before we go too far into that, I was curious what motivated the choice of each of the kind of 10 would they be called movements, the 10 dialectical movements, and especially why start with the gift? What motivated that for you?
That's the hardest question, and I do in the book kind of I have various ways of getting around that question, and so that's the obsession of Hegel too. That he's always asking, with what must a philosophy begin? And um, ultimately, the way he does philosophy means you've got to leave that beginning behind no matter what. And so, but he also doesn't think that it's purely arbitrary because of this. We talked about the structure previously, that it's not a foundation that needs to be secure, but at the same time, where you begin does in a way shape the possibilities that come after it. And it does feel natural to me to think of this one way that intimacy, the desire for intimacy feels so acute, but is so far away, is in wanting to give a gift. And so I'm thinking of teenagers who think of intimacy in terms of what they have to offer. Like they've never had a serious romantic relationship, say, before. And they understand this romantic relationship as a different in kind from all the relationships that they've had before in a way they can't really articulate yet. And so you're looking for, okay, what's the perfect gift? How can I secure this intimacy just through a gift? And you don't really want the gift to be to ask for something in return, because then it's not a gift. And you want it just to be a gift, and you want it to be welcome and perfect. But it can't just, if it's just something that you kind of hand in, then run away, then the intimacy is pretty quickly dissolved.
I could so see teenage boy, right? Like just like here, and I mean, it just feels. I can see Napoleon Dynamite doing that right now. That kind of awkwardness, which is the exact opposite of intimacy, right? Even though that's really what he wants. If I'm tracking with you.
Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say it's the opposite of intimacy. And so I think that you can see in it something that that's so sweet if you understand really what it is. But it, also, um, it is a very uh, uh, it breaks down as a form of intimacy very quickly. And so yeah, it's the opposite of intimacy in that it's very low level and far away from anything that might be a consummate intimacy, which again, there's no such thing.
Yeah,
And so
yeah. Actually, and that I think that's partly my mistake in thinking that awkwardness is the opposite of intimacy. It's not, right? You can have an awkward intimacy. Um, I well, understanding, of course, that intimacy is uh, in your version of things here an incoherent concept, but I could definitely see where there's that intimate moment between them that is at the same moment still awkward, right?
yeah, and so really what I think you're describing there is the dialectic between the between and the beyond.
Mm.
And I, uh, I talk about these terms in relationship to both Beauvoir and Kierkegaard. And so for them, uh, dialectics are kind of four terms in that you've got both parties and you've got what's between them and then what's beyond. And so like if we're watching this romantic comedy, the sequel to Napoleon Dynamite, where he finally starts to approach a girl that has this. I'm assuming that Napoleon Dynamite is straight. I don't remember the movie well enough, uh, but anyway, so he finally approaches her and has this awkward interaction with the gift. I think what makes that feel intimate in a way if they kind of sit on that awkwardness, is that it highlights the beyond.
Hmm.
And sometimes when you're deeper into a relationship, that between needs the beyond, needs the reminder that there is something that transcends whatever it is that can be held between both parties. And so for Irigori, this means we need to always be always, or at least repeatedly, find ourselves in a state of wonder and be drawn to the fact that there isn't any totality that is achieved between the two of us, that there is something that points beyond that. And that non consummation, I think, is what makes awkwardness just feel good in a way, especially from a third party perspective. Like, uh, and when we can tell the narratives of ourselves and we can say that part of our story, for instance, was not only that between, but that beyond.
Hmm.
But what the dialectical approach shows is that that intimacy was never really there in your recapitulation of it, of the between and the beyond that the partners shared and didn't share. Rather, that awkwardness was not a consummation of intimacy. That was it really is a failure of intimacy.
Hmm.
These two people are really not connecting in a crucial way too. They are different and they don't know what the next step is to achieve a regular give and take, say, of what I call a heartbeat.
Yes, yeah, and that kind of back and forth makes sense in this. Even as you talk about story, there's that consistent structure. Even and you talk about conflict, there is that consistent back and forth. Uh, I'm curious. Obviously, you choose these moments and these kind of occasions for dialectics to take place. I was kind of surprised when I looked at it. And it's funny considering that your project is about recognition. I thought that knowing and or being known would maybe be one of those moments. Um, is that something that would fit in this book? That it could be like an additional chapter? Is that something that's going to show up later in your project of recognition?
Yeah, so mostly what you're talking about is in the value book, that in being known as something, in being known as good or wise or hot or whatever value that I want to be associated with me, uh, that's not really intimacy. And so from our partners, we don't just want intimacy, we also want a pursuit of value. And sometimes that value is reflexive. We want to be valuable. And sometimes it's more about we want to live our values together. And sometimes it's more about I want to be able to have valuable things or pursue valuable goals. And I want to make sure that my partner is able to do that with me. And so those complicate relationships to a great degree. And so you're absolutely right to ask, like, isn't that important in a relationship too? I just don't think that those are ways that we pursue intimacy. In wanting my partner to think I'm beautiful, for instance, that it's a natural enough desire, but I'm I don't think that what I'm looking for there is more intimacy with them. Instead, that's wanting to be valuable in this particular way.
I think I'm tracking with you. Let me give kind of a for instance, because this is an example that kept coming up in my head as I was reading the book. And maybe this is a difference in terminology. Maybe this is me just misunderstanding the terminology. I'm happy to be stupid. That's, story of my life so far. So as we think about this, and when a moment happens and there's a variety of interpretations. My background's in philosophical hermeneutics, so this is kind of how I think about it. And you meet eyes with someone across the room, and there's so many different things they could be thinking, but in a way that even seems to transcend interpretation, you know exactly what they're thinking. That to me typifies a kind of intimate moment. But and to me that feels like I'm being seen, I am being known, and I am knowing the other person. But maybe I'm using the terms incorrectly, or maybe I'm misunderstanding intimacy. How would you explain that moment of, it kind of showed up a little bit in the humor and the irony, right? Like where you have this situation and it could be thought of in multiple different ways, but you almost can't help, you're trying to stifle laughter as you meet eyes across a room, and a lot of times that's what friendships are formed on, are those moments.
Good, yeah. And so I think those are they're different things that can be going on when you have that meeting of like I mean, one possibility obviously is it's completely one-sided, and this is a feeling that one person has, and actually their attitude is much more like that of a stalker, that they're projecting an intimacy that isn't really there.
Yeah. We just happen to meet eyes,
but
and the other person looks like they're connecting with. Yeah, sorry, I'm understanding.
Yeah, but like when it's a joke, and and so like no one else seems to be on the verge of laughter in the room, and the two of you can barely contain yourselves. That's irony. That's what makes it so intimate is you are actually enfolding everyone else in the room into something that the two of you are sharing. That what makes this moment so meaningful is the two of you get something about the situation, and really about life itself. So if it's genuinely funny to you, then probably what you're sharing is a sense of the breakdown of the meaning of everything at all. And so that what makes humor so delightful is just this the break between the intense buildup of tension and the collapse of all meaning at all. That's not my reading, that's Kant, basically on humor, supplemented with some contemporary evolutionary biology. But so, yeah, and that's what I call irony. It's a way of pursuing intimacy by sharing the fact that others can't share this moment with you. And that means that you're basically enfolding everyone else into the relationship. And so it's a more complicated version of the third that we began with talking about today, in that you've got your relationship is defined, or the intimacy of this kind is defined by the fact that the two of you can share something that others aren't sharing. And the non-sharing of those other people is something that is pretty contingent. So my favorite example of irony came, I discuss it in the book, I think. It came during one of the years, there was a riot following a Stanley Cup match.
Yes, you did mention this, but go ahead.
I think it was in Vancouver. And there was this beautiful picture taken of where this, I think it was a boyfriend had reached down to help up his girlfriend who had fallen during the riot. And you see in the background, there are police with riot shields, and there are flames in the distance. And he's kissing her, and it's a beautifully composed photograph. And you think, what perfect intimacy. And the structure of that intimacy is irony. It's perfect intimacy because all around things are burning. There's chaos, but we can have this one perfect moment. But that enfolding is always liable to be refolded by the relationship that each partner has to other people. So the guy in the photograph got called onto morning shows to talk about what happened. And so this private moment is actually something that he's sharing with whatever morning show host he was talking to or whatever.
Well, and you also said his mom was like interviewed, was talking about how romantic he is, which to me is very like, it definitely refolds in ways that you're like, you kind of removed some of the romance when you're like, oh, he's such a romantic boy. I just have this image, right?
Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. So yes, that mom, I think when you say mom in that way, what you're really doing is reacting to the sudden reorientation of the meaning. And one of the reasons why parents are so cringy is that when you are trying to live your life, and you're especially with the intensity that a teenager or a young adult tries to live their life with, this reminder that there is another very square perspective on the same phenomenon totally kills the mood.
Yes.
And so, and so that's the irony reading of what's going on. But the couple meeting each other across the room, meeting eyes, there's one more possibility that I wanted to throw out there. Maybe what you're doing is seeing the real possibility of a future together. And what makes that feel so intimate is that idea that no matter what comes to us, and I know there will be many unexpected things that come to us, I believe that I can spend my life with this person. And if that's the intense thought that you're having, it's either shared or not shared. If it's not shared, then it's just like that stalker situation I began with. But if it is shared, then that's what I call the future in the last chapter.
Right.
And that I think even orienting your relationship to the future with all its openness, and not having any concrete plans that would be a fetish that you're saying the relationship lives or dies based on whether we achieve these goals, not anything so concrete. But even an open acceptance of the future is still not sufficient to be a closeness beyond closeness, a form of intimacy. It would still be projecting some something outside of who the couple is that would ultimately secure their meaning. So for some religious people, this can be something like a second coming or some kind of messianic approach, like in Judaism, for instance, the work we all do to establish peace on earth, so that we have this second coming, so no matter how rich the detail you enfold into that future without making anything like a fetish, it's still not going to be our intimacy. And therefore, we're going to have to think about the fact that we're going to die, and that there is going to be that the fact that either we don't stay together forever or one of us sees the other one dead.
Unless you pull what is it? And it's a gruesome song, but my wife and I both love it. The Smiths, where it's like, and if a 10-ton truck, that is, but I don't know if you're familiar with it. There's a light that never goes out. And if a 10-ton truck kills the both of us, to die by your side would be such a heavenly way to die. But in either case, there's always going to be someone who doesn't mourn the other, which you make that point in the last chapter, right? And so mourning can never be the fulfillment of intimacy, because there's always someone who isn't doing the mourning, even if you both happen to pass away at the same time.
Yeah. Or the Romeo and Juliet situation, where you actually have both get to mourn each other, and because they both see the other one die. But even still, that mourning is not shared.
Yeah.
By each one of them does that mourning alone, even though it's it's not strictly alone. I mean, we're haunted by the people we've lost, and so we can't entirely say that it's something going on inside a single person's head. Right. That's too reductive, I think. I do think that mourning really is a way of pursuing intimacy, but it also can't really hang its hat on anything. It can't really say that I've done the mourning. So I've talked with my wife ever since early in our dating about our deaths, and we've both established that she should be the one to die first, because she would not be okay with me dying, and I want to know what it's like to lose her and then have 6 months to have that, and then I'll be done with life. So obviously there's something absurd about this planning, that we can't plan for how we're going to die. But the ways that we look for that meaning, right, in the fact that the other is going to die, that what I want out of that is consummating the relationship in some way. So this consummation of the relationship really is doing it all. But as I wrote about that, I realized, no, that's not a consummate relationship. That's not doing it all. That's just that completist urge to have the whole relationship. It still is an abstraction that fails to really get everything that was there in the relationship.
It would be odd to say, I'm looking forward to mourning you, right? Like that would, I mean, I could see situations where someone could say that, but that it's like, I'm pretty sure that would create some distance in the intimacy. Probably, but um, I want to be considerate of your time. You talked about the future, and it almost seems like there's a present where you unfold yourselves. You're embedded against the world. I'm curious when we talk about eyes meeting across, like in the case of, let's say, two parents, Christmas morning, kids are opening the presents. Is there a way in which meeting eyes across could be a way of looking back at the past, and could that be an intimate moment where there's a sense of completion, of satisfaction, of what we've created is good?
Definitely. And so, I mean, it can be a recognition of the work that both parties have done. And in this way, it can also be a kind of recognition of value of that each party contributed something to this moment. It can be just we each love them so damn much. And that's like the fetish. That's this, or irony too, or I mean, the third, the embedding, uh, that our meaning is there in the love of our children.
Hmm.
And it's also still, I think, probably a recognition of the future that um, uh, we're going to get more things like this, but they're not going to be exactly like this.
Right.
Our kids will never be this young, and they'll never be excited in exactly the same way. And so the two of you understanding in the same way what that future holds, it can feel very intimate, but intimacy is never a feeling. If it's just a feeling, then a feeling is something that only takes place inside one person's skull. And
which you reject because of the stalker thing, right? Like just because a stalker feels intimate with somebody doesn't mean that intimacy is happening, especially as he watches someone who's not even aware of his presence.
Yeah, and also because of touching the our relationship to our feelings is asymmetrical. Even when I touch you and you feel me touch you, we have different relationships to that. We're not really sharing the touch. And so I think that so long as we emphasize feelings, we're farther away from that, which is another reason why I find both Hegel and Beauvoir to be useful guides. They're always reminding me to get over myself. In fact, that could be the tagline of the phenomenology of spirit, like phenomenology of spirit or get over yourself. So,
might help it reach like New York
Beauvoir,
Times bestseller list. That's
yeah. Maybe you'd have to get rid of the first part
yes,
too.
yeah. Just get over yourself by Hegel. A radical translation. Yes.
Yeah, and so I think that although feelings are always useful guides that can't be dismissed, there's a lot of intelligence that's built into why we feel the way we do. When we think that the feeling is what's most real or what matters most, that's when we're being our most solipsistic.
Yeah, and that which is, of course, the opposite of what intimacy should be. Kind of as a last question for our listeners, as you've taken this journey, like this dialectical journey through intimacy, what has been the most important things that you feel that you have learned, or the most important parts of those journeys for yourself?
I just so I
No
just
pressure. Yeah.
emphasize that what I get out of Hegel and Beauvoir is get over yourself. And so now I've got to move in the opposite direction to answer this question. I've got to say, why did this book matter for me? So, like, how can I integrate this dialectical narrative into a narrative of my life and my achievement in becoming who I am? And I think I want to beg off that question.
That's
actually,
totally
but
fine.
I'll try to do it. I'll try to. I mean, I'll at least try to do it in a personally informative way, so that it doesn't just because.
Yeah, I was not looking for like intense personal examples of intimacy. My apologies for
No. Oh no, not that at all.
Okay.
But in a Hawaiian context, especially where I am right now, someone is only really worth listening to if they're willing to put themselves into the discussion to some extent. And that's something that I naturally do anyway, just because of the way that my mind works, that sometimes I show up in the narrative. And so I will share that the reason why I don't want to make this book about me is there is too much of a tendency for, so this is all audio and people aren't seeing me. I'm a white guy. And so much of the stories that we've told about the history of philosophy have been emphasized on how they mattered for white people, white men especially. And I don't think that having the journey of self-discovery of a white man highlighted is doing anyone any favors. We don't need to know anything more about, I mean, so the Romantics covered this back with the Sorrows of Young Werther and the intense, I mean, the term Bildungsroman was invented for this kind of journey of self-discovery, of what it means in struggling through a particular kind of work to come to a deeper understanding of yourself. That's something that is, I think, one contribution that one can make to understanding what it means to be a human being. But there are enough of those stories out there that I don't need to add any. If I had a really good one, I would write more. I had a really good story to that effect, I'd add one, because why not? But I don't have it, and I don't think that it's. I don't feel all that bad about not having prepared one, because I don't think that that's really where philosophy needs to be right now. I don't think that we need more of those kinds of stories.
Thank you. Appreciate it. That's a very thoughtful answer. And one, just want to say thank you for coming on today. Thank you for sharing your time, and thank you for your work on your book. It was an enjoyable read.
Thank you so much. This was fun.